On a long, sweltering July afternoon, a small family drove their camper across the endless plains of Wyoming. The sun hovered high, glaring and relentless, bending the asphalt into shimmering ribbons that seemed to ripple under the heat. The air was dry and heavy, carrying the faint, sweet scent of prairie grass and the acrid tang of dust from the unpaved stretches of road. Wind stirred occasionally, brushing across the plains in subtle waves, whispering through the tall grass, bending stalks like the motions of unseen hands. The journey was long and quiet. The hum of the camper's engine was a constant companion, punctuated by the occasional call of a hawk overhead or the distant rumble of livestock on far-off ranches. The family passed abandoned silos, weathered barns, and the occasional solitary tree that bent in impossible angles, twisted by decades of relentless wind. At brief stops along the highway, they noticed shadows that lingered too long at the edges of the fields, or the faint impression of shapes moving where no one stood. It was nothing they could name, nothing tangible, yet it left a prickling unease, a subtle warning carried in the heat and the wind. At last, the road curved, and the towering shape of Devil's Tower appeared. Abrupt, jagged, and impossibly vertical, it rose like a monument of ancient stone, slicing the sky with unnatural sharpness. Its vertical striations caught the late sunlight, glowing with faint gold and copper hues, while the shadow at its base stretched far across the forested edge of the campground. The sight silenced the family in awe and a flicker of fear, a monument so massive, so silent, that it seemed to hold centuries of memory in its rigid face. The campground was modest, a small clearing dotted with trailers, RVs, and a squat, peeling white building at the far edge. The restaurant. Its windows glimmered faintly, and the scent of coffee and fried food drifted into the air. Locals moved slowly, almost reverently, their polite nods carrying something unspoken. When pressed about the tower, many offered only whispers, sacred ground, spirits bound to stone, grief that lingered longer than memory itself. A young man working the restaurant spoke briefly of native lore, mentioning the Lakota beliefs. That Devil's Tower was a place where spirits gathered, especially those wronged in life, those tied to betrayal, loss, or untimely death. Lightning was not always merely weather here, he said, but memory striking stone again and again. Evening settled with a lazy glow, the sun beginning its descent behind the towering monolith. The family sat inside the camper, watching Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a nostalgic reminder of childhood fascination with strange lights and distant worlds. The flickering images of the tower in the film seemed to echo the real one outside, a strange resonance that made the edges of reality feel thinner. When the credits rolled, curiosity drew them outside. The air was cooler now, yet charged with stillness. Across the plains, distant thunderstorms rumbled lazily, July storms drifting like slow, dark ghosts across the horizon. Lightning flickered in the far distance, never approaching, but casting deep, rolling shadows across the tall grasses. And then, faintly, on the face of the tower, lights appeared. At first, they thought of climbers with headlamps, but the park had long since closed, and the movements made no sense. The lights floated independently, blinking in arcs and patterns that human hands could not follow. They vanished and reappeared, rising higher, circling impossibly, as though choreographed by an invisible mind. The family watched in silence, a mixture of awe and apprehension knitting them together, their eyes tracing the movements that seemed to ignore the pull of gravity. The next day, curiosity drew them along a winding trail that skirted the base of the tower. The forest here was alien, unsettling. Trees grew sideways along the earth, their trunks bending in angles that defied reason before arching skyward again. Some appeared shattered, broken by unseen forces, others twisted as if writhing in silent agony. The effect was subtle, insistent, as though nature itself had been coaxed into impossible shapes. Strips of colored cloth, red, yellow, blue, were tied to many of the branches, fluttering in the slightest breeze. These were offerings, prayers, remnants of generations who had long considered the tower sacred. The family paused, noting the weight of history and belief that seemed to hang on the branches like moss. The wind carried whispers from the plains beyond, faint and unintelligible, shaping the air with a presence they could not name. The distant thunder rumbled intermittently, a low, rolling reminder that the world beyond the tower moved differently, slowly, with its own hidden rhythm. As the afternoon bled into evening, the husband set up his camera. He intended to capture the tower in its glowing twilight. He activated the rapid 3-shot sequence, each flash snapping in quick succession. The family waited, holding their breath. The air heavy with anticipation, insects buzzing faintly in the grass, distant lightning illuminating the low clouds far beyond the plains. Later, when the images were reviewed, the first 2 frames revealed only the tower, empty, silent, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. But the 3rd photo caught it. A figure, pale and almost translucent, standing on the very flat summit of Devil's Tower. Backlit by the fiery sun, the figure was fleeting and unreal, a single heartbeat of presence that the eye alone could have missed. It stood motionless, neither threatening nor welcoming, its form a whisper against the stone. For a moment, the family felt the weight of time and grief press down, a subtle shiver that traveled the spine. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the presence was gone, the spirit having vanished into the thin air above the tower. Night fell slowly over the campground. The distant lights on the tower flickered, darting across the striated face like faint fireflies in impossible patterns. The trees around the campsite leaned slightly toward the tower, the colored cloths snapping gently in the soft wind. Footsteps whispered across the ground at intervals, never close enough to locate. A subtle sense of being observed pressed on them, unseen eyes brushing against the edges of perception. Inside the camper, they reflected on the photograph again and again. The fleeting spirit on the summit lingered in their minds, an echo that refused to fade. Was it sorrow, curiosity, or some ancient sentinel watching over the plains? They did not know, and the uncertainty made the air heavy, tangible, like a breath held too long. By midnight, sleep was elusive. Each faint rustle outside the camper, each distant call of wildlife, seemed magnified. The lights from the tower continued their slow dance, rising, pausing, vanishing, reappearing, as if in silent conversation with whatever had been captured in the photograph. The distant thunderstorms rolled across the horizon, casting muted flashes that illuminated the twisted trees for a heartbeat before darkness reclaimed them. Dawn eventually crept across the plains. The family packed the camper in near silence, moving with deliberate care. Devil's Tower receded behind them, its shadow shrinking but never fully leaving their minds. The photograph remained on the dashboard, a single frame capturing a fleeting moment of something ancient and unseen. Its presence haunted the edges of thought, a reminder that the world sometimes brushes against the impossible for just a heartbeat. Weeks later, the photograph remained, and with it the knowledge that the tower held more than stone and sky. Sometimes, on quiet July evenings, the lights might return, drifting across the vertical face. And on the flat summit, framed in the dying sunlight, one might glimpse again the fleeting sentinel, pale, motionless, eternal in its imperceptible watch. Waiting for someone to come back.